I got a chance to read over your book, and I just think it's so incredible that it's really inspired by your decades long friendship. So let's jump right in and share how your friendship was sort of the inspiration for this book.
Well, actually, a lady who was really concerned about diversity, she said, because of Gary and your friendship, you guys ought to write a book together. And so I found I was able to sweet talk him into writing the book with me. And, it's, as a kid, as a 14-year-old, I was going to all black school that was segregated in Winston-Salem, even though it was after the Civil Rights, Act and integration laws were passed. And so my buddy, who I guess girls thought was cute, went to this school, went to this church where Gary was the youth director. And so I was kind of his bodyguard. He was really short. He was only 4 feet, 8 inches tall. And I was much bigger. I was 4 feet 9. And so, so he went to this group, this pretty much white church that really scared our parents for us to even go there because racial tensions were so tight. But when we got there, we were only 2 kids out of about 100. And some of the parents or other people there looked a little concerned, but I went to the basketball court and Gary came over and introduced himself, which is really friendly. And I kind of felt safe with him. I felt, hey, we'd probably be okay. So that's sort of how we met. And I've been grateful for that ever since.
Wow. Yep, I remember in those days, it was really a lot of racial tension in Winston-Salem. I remember the National Guard was called out. I've seen them out on the sidewalks, several days, and all sorts of things were going on. But after that evening was over in the gymnasium, I just said to both of them, I said, hey guys, we're here every Tuesday night and you guys are always welcome. And they started coming. So, I have to give Clarence the credit for starting our relationship because otherwise I would never have met him. And the fact that they kept coming, we were spending time with each other. That was the beginning of all of it.
Yeah. That's incredible. So you guys have been friends for decades. So why write this book now? What is it about the current cultural climate that made you decide now was the time to pen this book?
Well, Gary has said this for years, and I haven't always agreed with him, but I actually do now. But this book has been written a long time ago. In fact, when the woman asked me about it, it was actually 2008. And so we really haven't made a lot of progress. And so, the way it worked out, when Gary and I agreed to do it, it was like 2017. And then he had his writing schedule, I had mine. And then we thought the book was ready. They pushed it back even a year, but it seems to be God's timing. So I guess Gary was correct when he said anytime's a good time for his book. But it does seem right now, with people so divided, you have people who are for critical race theory, some who are against it. You have some for 1619 Project, some against it. And you have your political background. And so I think what Gary and I are trying to do, we say our friendship should really supersede all of that, especially if we're Christians. And it doesn't mean we have to agree on everything, but we can still be friends. And I think if we're friends, we have more patience to listen to each other. And I think we also can learn from each other. I've learned a lot from Gary, just in the whole area of diversity and respect and how your faith works in the midst of conflict and tension.
Yeah, and I think what motivated me to really get on board with writing this book with Clarence is I just began to look around in the last 2 or 3 years and what's happening in our country with race relationships. And I'm thinking, man, I thought we were further along than this. We're almost back to where we were, all those years ago. And I know we're not exactly. Now, a lot of things have changed for the better, but there's an awful lot of animosity there and distrust and that sort of thing. And so I just think I think a lot of Christians, especially, we're writing primarily to Christians in this book. Yeah. I think a lot of Christians have felt in the last 2 or 3 years, what can I do? What can I do about it? It seems so much bigger than me. What can one person do? Well, here's something one person can do. They can pursue trying to initiate a conversation and then later a friendship, if it develops into that, where you can really get to know a person of another race or culture, learn from each other, and let the other person explain to you what's going on in their culture and in their mind, while you do the same with you. And if enough people did that, it would make a change in the country. And so that's one thing that's doable for every Christian.
Absolutely. Now, talk about some of the fundamentals of having a cross-cultural friendship, because in the book you talk about how this isn't really just a black and white issue. There are many different cultures, many different barriers. So, what are some of the fundamentals of building a friendship of somebody from another culture?
Well, I think you have to be intentional. Um, I think it's really important. When Gary came on the basketball court I think to greet me, maybe make me feel comfortable. He was very intentional about that. He came up to me, introduced himself, said who he was. He shook my hand and said a couple of things, and just that was really important to me. And maybe he sensed that. And so I think we have to be intentional. Again, the book is not a binary book. It's not just black and white, but across cultural lines, someone has to do that. And I think you have to be willing to take risk. And I think you have to take risk of possibly even being rejected or misunderstood. But kind of like Jesus with the Samaritan woman, he had staying power. And so even when she initially rejected him, he kind of hung around and kept talking, asking questions, and eventually connected with her, and she connected with him.
Yeah, I think many Christians, we all encounter people of different races or cultures, depending on what part of the country we live in, because it's many cultures in our society, and so we have some encounter. We're passing each other here or there in the grocery store or church or wherever. But what we're saying is, let's take it a step further than just saying, hi, how are you? Is everything okay? Yeah, everything's okay. Let's just start a conversation and ask questions of someone of a different race or culture and just see what God does.
Yeah.
Clarence and I didn't set out. I mean, at his age or my age, either one, we didn't set out to say, let's build a lifelong friendship. We just start out by treating each other with dignity and respect and treating them like they were a friend. And eventually we became friends.
Yeah.
So I think if Christians can get the picture that, we're all God's children, if we've accepted Christ, we're going to spend eternity in heaven. So let's get to know people, Christians and non-Christians, because sometimes beginning a friendship and conversation with someone that's not a Christian, if they see that you're respecting them and interested in them, they may be interested in your God, So as Christians, we're always thinking evangelism, and discipleship, with whomever we encounter. But that doesn't mean if they don't accept Christ, we're to have nothing to do with them. No. Exactly. We're going to stick with them as long as they stick with us.
Yeah, that's good. Now, talk about the importance of words. And the power of words when we're building these friendships. I thought it was so interesting in the book how you talk about how it's not always helpful to say things like, well, I'm colorblind, right? So talk more about this idea.
Well, let's get to the colorblind thing, but Gary, why don't you tell Leah the words you used when you first met James and me, or you can't pick us up for the first time. Talk about that word.
Yeah, I drove up in front of Clarence's house, and he and James, his friend, were sitting on the porch. And I got out of my car and I was walking down the sidewalk toward the house, and I said, "You boys ready to go?" And his friend James said, "I ain't no boy." And I stopped and I said, "Okay, James, I think we need to talk." And I said, "But let's hold it because we got to get to the meeting. And after the meeting's over, you and Clarence and I'll talk because I want to hear what you got to say, man. Okay." And so that night after it was over, Clarence, I don't know, we may have talked 2 hours.
Yeah.
Wow.
And Clarence, you tell us how James and what you were feeling with that word.
Well, the thing was, the funny part about it was we were boys. I mean, I was 14. I think James was 13, even though he was about 6'2". But the thing was, we'd seen our dads, grown men, call boys in a very demeaning way. And Gary didn't know that or understand that. So in our culture, the rule was you don't let any white person call you boy, even if you are a boy, because it's demeaning. And so we had that conversation, and again, that's what blessed us, James and me, to be with Gary, because here you have this grown man taking time to want to know our perspective during a time of tremendous racial tension. So we sat down, he shared his perspective, which we understood, and then we shared ours. And then, and he never called us boy again. And even though after that, he could have, and we would have understood. So I think it's taking time to work through conflict and differences. And in that case, we agreed, but there are other times you can have conflict and you may agree to disagree. In regards to colorblind, I do a lot of diversity consulting and training for organizations. And a lot of people, and I think most, have good intentions when they say colorblind, and they're trying to think about equality. But for people of color, and we've also learned this for women, when people talk about we're all the same, I don't see, or colorblind, we tend to interpret that as you don't see me or you don't value me, which is not what they really intend, but it comes across that way. And then the other question is, if you're colorblind, then are we all the same? And we really aren't. And so I think I think we need to learn to celebrate differences, because God does in 1 Corinthians 12, when he talks about spiritual gifts, differences are really a plus to the body. But with those differences, if you're going to have biblical unity, you also have an interdependency. And so I need Gary, he needs me, we learn from each other. And it was funny, I could see Gary was white, but back then we weren't used to anybody white being nice to us. So I was trying to process that whole idea of him being white, but he definitely was not black. So I knew that. So colorblind is really not the best term to use in building cross-cultural relationships.
So talk about how we define and sort of live out the word love when it comes to cross-cultural friendships.
Well, I think there are a few words in the English language more important than the word love and more misunderstood than the word love. We think of romantic love, we think of a lot of the ways we use the word, but as Christians, the word love is not a feeling. It's an attitude. At least it doesn't begin with a feeling. It begins with an attitude. And it's the attitude that Christ had, when he left heaven, came to earth, got on level ground with us, and then humbled himself to death on a cross. And so he said that you love others like I love you. And he loved us when we were unlovely. We weren't seeking him. He reached out to seek us. So love in the Bible is an attitude that I want to enrich the lives of the people whom I encounter on a regular basis in my life. I want to do something to enrich their lives. And when I reach out to seek to enrich their lives, if they can find out why and how I can do that, then yes, it does create emotion inside of them. When we feel love, then we have warm feelings toward that person. We have gratitude toward that person for reaching out to us. But it doesn't begin with a warm feeling. Like falling in love begins with a feeling, but not this kind of love. It begins with an attitude and then appropriate behavior. And yes, there will be emotions there, to be sure, but it doesn't start with an emotion.
And I just want to give some examples of that. Gary had me come to his house for dinner one time to meet his wife and his kids. And that meant a lot to me. And then, and he also took risks. I saw how his neighbors looked at him by having me come into his house. Because remember, we were still segregated back then. When he was doing my ordination sermon, he shared how his two children, Derek and Shelley, prayed for me on a regular basis, which I never knew. I mean, and there's so many things that he actually did love. Or when I was a student at Moody Bible Institute, I don't know if it's before my dad died or not, but he would look at the weather forecast and he sent me $35, say it's cold up there, get you a sweater. And so those were things of love that to me were priceless. So he modeled that and initiated that to me, which just made me love him all the more.
Now, share the 3 ways to resolve conflict in cross-cultural friendship, because I thought this was such an interesting part of the book and one that I hadn't really thought about before.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we have to be empathetic with each other, by which I mean, when the other person's talking, we have to listen with an intent to understanding how they're viewing things and what they're feeling. We won't solve conflicts if we're not good listeners. We have to learn to listen to the other person and understand what they're saying. But once we've heard each other out, and we can say, like I said to Clarence and James that night, or early on, I said, hey guys, I get it now. I get it. I see what you're saying. I see how that's offensive to you. And I said, but if I were talking picking up two white guys. At your age, I'd have called them boys. I said the same thing, and they understood me. So how do we solve it? Well, I decided, man, I'm not going to use that word again now that I understand that. And see, and their attitude changed and said, well, you could use it. It's okay now. We understand, But so sometimes the three ways we resolve a conflict, once we've heard each other and understood each other, is what I call, one is I'll meet you on your side, which means one of you decides to go over to the other's position, and you say, now that I hear it and now that I understand it, I'm going to agree with you. And sometimes we can do that. And then sometimes we have to meet in the middle. I'll meet you in the middle, which means we find something in the middle of what each of us were talking about, our positions. And we say, well, can we agree on this? And sometimes we can. And so we find a meeting in the middle. And then sometimes we have to say, I'll meet you later, which means we don't agree now. We disagree on this, but it's not going to affect our relationship. We're just going to agree to disagree on this. And listen, we can disagree on a whole lot of things and still be friends. Yeah. I mean, friendship is an attitude and a commitment to the well-being of the other person. And we can disagree on a whole lot of things and still have a friendship where we're sharing life with each other and doing everything we can to help each other become what we believe and they believe God wants them to become.
That's wonderful. So ultimately, for both of you, what is your goal? What is your hope for this book?
Well, my hope for the book, is that people will actually go out and prayerfully, with God's help and the direction of the Holy Spirit, build some friendships cross-culturally. And I pray that will help change their worldview. We're not trying to get anybody to change their political view and stuff like that, but just begin to build some cross-cultural friendships. And we really believe that will help improve race relations in America. Part of frustration we have is that typically one group of people doesn't understand another group of people. Yeah. But if we start building relationships, kind of like, Gary and the whole thing about boy, once we understand, a lot of times when we understand, that alleviates a lot of frustration. I think there are a lot of frustrated people because they don't understand. Now, also understanding is not equal agreement, but a lot of times when we understand, that can often lead us to agreement. But I think we have that friendship, there's a trust factor. And so even if Gary and I disagree on something, well, I know he still loves me. I know he's not going anywhere. He knows the same thing about me. And we're still family. And so I think if people would do that, it would change your worldview. And I think when you have a relationship, I think when you don't have relationships, it's easy to dehumanize other people who aren't like you, from a political perspective or cultural, racial perspective. But when we understand and build that relationship, then we see people as humans and we see them as valuable. And then we understand, hey, if God created them, then there's maybe something I can learn from them. So I think that's my goal, is that people will, I would love to see 1 million people develop who don't have cross-cultural friendships, develop cross-cultural friendships. And I just think that would improve the quality of life in America and decrease some of the racial tension.
Yeah, and that's the theme that kind of runs through the book in terms of what can I do? Mm-hmm. It is, what if every Christian in this country had at least one close personal friendship with someone of a different race or culture? Mm-hmm. What would happen? Okay, so you're asking, what can I do? Okay, here's something you can do. It's doable. Yeah. Anyone can reach out and begin the process of building a friendship with someone who's different from them. And so that's our hope, is that will begin to happen, individual by individual, one relationship at a time. And when we develop more understanding of each other, a larger number of people develop that understanding, it's going to change. It's going to change the climate of the culture.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it'll also create more patience, and I just think it can be a great thing. And then as you build cross-cultural friendships, it doesn't just impact those two people, but it impacts their families and then their friends as well. So it just has almost a multi-generational impact if we do this.